Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday, January 23rd edition of the SIG Cluster Lifecycle subproject meeting for the Cluster API. Today, we're going to get started talking about the provider ID for machines. This is pull request 565, if you're following along in the meeting notes. We've had some discussions in the past about putting a provider-specific ID in. It was initially proposed as part of the autoscaler. I think people agreed it was too early to do it for that reason, but there were lots of other good reasons that we might want to have this field inserted. And we're having sort of a lively discussion about whether it should be in the spec, in the status, in both places, etc. So Hardik pinged this, I think, yesterday, saying let's try to get this resolved so we can move forward. So I stuck it first on the agenda because I thought this might take a few minutes for people to weigh in and express their opinions.
Yes, so I think we had a lot of opinions and it was pretty well summarized at the PR as well. But I guess the good idea is to choose one and go ahead. It could be either spec or status. I do not have such any strong opinions here. It's better to actually choose one for now, and whenever we see a need, we can certainly move.
Yeah, I was chatting with Tim Hawken about this, trying to pick his brain about sort of best practices for Kubernetes. And he gave me a recommendation, but said that I should double check with Justin first. So I'm curious, Justin, what you think. I gave you like 2 minutes warning before the meeting started to think about it.
I vote spec. It would be interesting if Tim said status.
Tim also said spec, so I think
you can't recreate it.
If Hardik's point is yeah, that we should pick one and go with it, I think spec makes sense. We also went back and forth a little bit about whether it should be in spec and status, because then if you specify it, you hope that spec and status actually match, and you expect the controller to reconcile if they don't. And if you don't specify it, then sort of the controller just posts to status, which is sort of another interesting way to think about it. But I think for now, we're fine just sticking it in spec and treating it sort of the same way as the external IP in services. Would that be reasonable from people's point of view? Hardik is nodding, even though he's muted. Okay. All right, so I think this particular PR probably needs to have make run on it so that we actually update the CRD documentation, and it's not passing all the precedents at the moment. But it does stick it just into spec. So I think the changes to the API are what we just discussed, and we just need to sort of flush it out and then get it merged.
I missed about 30 seconds of audio due to technical problems on my end.
Okay.
I just wanted to point out that as we add changes like this, it would be really good to have documentation. I don't know that it has to be a blocking thing, but I mean, it needs to happen. And I think part of the reason it's good is that when you write down the intent of a field, it forces you to really think about like what it means, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I guess one question here is, this particular PR came out of, let's use it for the autoscaler. If that's Vicus's sort of main reason to send it, he may not be interested in pushing it through and updating the documentation and so forth. So one option we could do is, Hardik, if you want to create like a new PR, update the Gitbook and run make to get all of the other bits in shape, we could just sort of close this one in favor of a newer version. That might be the fastest way to get the change in.
Sure, we can do that.
Yeah, so we can ping this one first, and then I don't know if it looks like from GitHub that Vicus is also in. So this might be a bad time for him to join this meeting, but you might be able to catch him during sort of working hours and see if he wants to finish it, or if he'd rather have you do it for him.
Thank you. No.
I have a question. Is it helpful to think of this field as analogous to the node field in a pod spec? As in a pod So a pod is to a machine as a provider ID is to some node.
A pod is to a machine as a provider ID is to a node. And that node field in a pod spec can be specified by users, but generally is not. You can use it to pin pods to machines, I guess for people that don't know. But generally what happens is you don't specify it. The scheduler sees that it's not set, goes through, assigns it, and that's what actually assigns a pod to a machine. I think that might be sort of a great way to think about it. I guess the only difference is that in this case, sort of the same controller would be assigning the value as sort of using the value instead of having that responsibility distributed across two different things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's maybe another good example, and where the field is in the spec, but it's set programmatically by a controller.
Right.
Yeah, that's maybe a better analogy to use than the one I've been using about service IPs.
Okay,
Like
I'll add it to the issue.
Cool, thank you. All right, I guess that's also sort of further evidence that it should be in spec, right? If we think about it that way. And I think in a lot of ways, it's sort of the same use case where generally you would expect users not to ever want to set this field, but automation may want to set this field, right? Which is sort of similar to generally users don't try to pin things to machines, and we let the automation, i.e. the scheduler, do it. But there are cases where you might want to do it yourself. Cool. Okay, so I think the action here is for Hardik. I'm assigning this to you to follow up with Vicus and see if he wants to finish the PR, or if you want to just close that one and open a new one. And by finish the PR, I think I'm referring to what David mentioned, which is like we need to follow through and like actually add documentation around the field, both in the API spec and in the Git book, to make sure we sort of dot the I's and cross the T's. Cool. All right. Next on the agenda is that it's not possible to represent no taints in the machine.spec.taints. What do you mean by no taints, Daniel?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Right. So if we look at the types, there is in the machine spec, there is a taints field that is used. So if I want, I create a machine object and I want a specific set of taints to be applied to that machine by whatever. By the actuator, right, or by whatever I'm using to provision Kubernetes on that node, right? And so I think there are three possible values that this field can take, right? It can be an absence, and that should indicate that whatever is applying taints should just figure out whatever its default is and use that. I also may want to say that there should be no taints applied, right? Let's say that I'm, creating a master, but I want my workloads to run on that master for whatever reason, right? I want no taints applied, and then of course maybe I have a specific set of taints that I want to apply to the node. So today. The last two are possible, but the first one, the absence of taints, is not possible, and that is because if you provide an empty slice in the machine struct, and then you marshal it to some configuration, or even if you don't marshal it to some configuration, but you use it internally, there's no way to distinguish between the absence of taints and just saying that I haven't provided any value. Please set a default. And so that's the issue. There's also a similar issue in the kubeadm types, and I think one way to address this is to change the type from a slice to a pointer to a slice. And so when it's nil, that means nothing has been specified. When it's an empty slice, that means the user has said no taints should be applied to this node. And then, of course, if there are items in the slice, then that means that there's some specific set.
Which type is this in Kubernetes?
I'm sorry, let me give a link. So this is under the machine types and, oops. Yeah, machine spec taints. So let me actually just paste this in the chat here, and then I'll add it to the meeting notes as well.
While you're doing that, I also linked in the notes to issue number 493. Right now, our documentation says that taints is the full authoritative list, like I'm reading from what you just linked in chat. The full authoritative list of taints to apply to the node. Write any modifications made to the node on an ongoing basis. And Derek mentioned in 493 that the labels, taints, and annotations should be additive and not authoritative, which I think I agree with, because if it's authoritative, that means if you have other automation that's trying to apply taints or cordon or drain or whatever else, you're just going to end up with that automation fighting with the machine controller. Whereas if the machine controller says, these are the taints that I expect to be there, these are the labels I expect to be there, but if other ones are there, that's also okay, then setting no taints or labels for the machine controller means that the machine won't be created with any taints or labels, but you can still add them later and we won't remove them, which I think makes a lot of sense. So I think what you're asking for, Daniel, is in that case, if we want to say create a machine, it shouldn't start off out with any labels or taints, that should be sort of explicit through the API of like, it's empty, not, it's sort of, it's explicitly empty via using a pointer as opposed to it's an empty list.
Right. Yeah. And the reason that I brought this up here at all is that I am using the cluster API types, and then taking the values there and then generating a kubeadm configuration. So and I found this issue in the kubeadm configuration, and I realized, okay, even if I fix it there, I still won't be able to pass it. Pass this indicate an absence of taints if I'm using the cluster API types.
What is, I'm just going to ask, what is the taint that you don't want to specify, as it were?
So for example, on a master, I don't want no scheduling taint, which is applied by default by kubeadm.
I mean, so that's, I was going to say, like, can we just make it not apply taints by default to make you specify them, right? At least in our, like, we definitely have a problem in API machinery where we have been a little bit loosey-goosey about the difference between a nil pointer and an empty list. And this has come up again and again, where we sort of have accidentally got them confused. And I think the other side of that coin is it is generally hard in clients, like, to make that distinction, right? So some languages have a clearer distinction of that than others. Some programming languages do.
Is this also related to the what fields we can default via mutating webhooks? Because I know there was an issue where if we are not using pointers, we can't default fields via webhooks. Is this a case where if we wanted to default taints and it's a slice instead of a pointer to a slice, we wouldn't be able to default it in a webhook? Because that would be another argument for making it a pointer.
Yes, yeah, that's right. David, I think you when we spoke, at the office hours, you reminded me of that issue. Let me find it and add it to the.
Is there an issue logged against kubeadm for this?
I'm filing one this morning. I haven't clicked submit yet.
Okay, we can definitely address this.
Thanks.
Daniel, can I ask which manifest do you want to modify?
Sorry, in which context? Cluster API or kubeadm?
In kubeadm, basically. Where do you want to make a modification? Which manifest?
It's the machine spec. I added a link at the very beginning on the meeting agenda, and I think I pasted it into the chat. Yeah, it's the machine spec, and there is a taints field.
I'm just wondering if it's already possible using kubeadm init phases. But I need context on which pod exactly you want.
It's in the join config. The taint is passed through in the join config.
Okay. Yeah, maybe log in an issue so that we can have a better look, I guess.
I'm working on an issue. I just need to click submit. I just haven't wrapped it up, but because of this meeting, so.
Yeah, so I think one thing is, if with the slice we have today, if we leave it empty and say that means no taints, one way to fix this would be if we fix kubeadm, the translation logic could say if there are no taints here, I tell kubeadm not to use taints. But I think your other point about using a pointer is valid for other reasons, I would say, right? So I think there's sort of two different issues you're raising. One is that with kubeadm, we need to have a way to specify, to basically remove those taints from that node, so that it's schedulable. And you could do that without changing the machine definition of how taints are specified. But we should probably also change the machine definition of how taints are specified, both for consistency with kubeadm and so that we can default it.
Yeah.
By the way, we are currently implementing join phases for kubeadm. So maybe that is going to help. Again, I have to look at the issue. But the join phases are gonna help break down the join process. We already have this for init, but I guess I was confusing the pods and nodes here. But yeah, I need to look at this.
Yeah, and I think in general, I'll add a link to the API conventions doc does describe this issue, and there are actually a couple of quite old sort of umbrella issues. One is like to address these kind of changes, like changing to pointers in the V2 API. So it looks like this is a problem that's been around, but here we have an alpha API. I think maybe we have a chance to to address it where for other APIs maybe that's just not possible anymore. So yeah, so I'll file an issue and I will link it to the two issues, Robbie, that you mentioned, and then the other one for the webhooks.
Yeah, I'll also get, there's also a pull request to update the taints comment in the machine spec, which is also related to this as well. That one looks like it needs a rebase, but we should also probably get that in because, like I said, when I pulled up the document from the thing that you sent, I think it's not actually what we want that field to be described as doing.
Okay.
Chuck, do you want to expand on your comment that you made in chat? I think that's pretty important.
Oh, yeah. It sounded like kubeadm is not handling pointers and taint lists right, but I think but I'm not sure if. Yeah, but I'm just kind of confused as to where the issue with kubeadm is coming from, because it appears, according to the comment, that we do handle the empty list versus nil correctly in kubeadm, but I don't know if there's something I'm missing. If it's like the additive property that we're talking about that isn't handled correctly.
Yeah, it does. So the problem isn't that kubeadm doesn't handle the input correctly. It is not possible to use the kubeadm types to marshal an empty slice. So if you generate the kubeadm config by hand or dynamically, you can do this. But if you're using a Go program to generate the configuration, then you won't have that option because of the omit empty and the way Go handles an empty slice by.
Yeah.
Oh, that's by design though. That's explicit in the API reference. That's done on purpose. Because well, we could debate this one. I don't know if we want a rabbit hole here, but why don't we can open the issue and talk about it. That's explicitly done on purpose.
Okay. Yeah, well, yeah. I'll file the issue and then we can take it offline.
Okay. It would be great if you, for those of us that may not have a chance to follow along with your issue explicitly, to sort of come back to this meeting maybe next week and sort of summarize the conclusions from there. I'll try to find the issue and follow it, but that may or may not end up actually happening. All right. So next, I put 670 in here. So 2 weeks ago, we discussed a process for updating project maintainers. So sort of spurred by Vince sending a PR saying, I think I'm ready, please add me so we can increase project velocity. Tim gave some background about how it works for, Tim and Lubomir both gave background about how it works for kubeadm. And we sort of chose to follow the same process that kubeadm does, where we are sort of cycling people both in and out on approximately maybe quarterly basis. Sort of we'll see how that goes. And so I created this PR. It's been sitting for about 2 weeks. I think it's ready to go in. I haven't seen any objections, but I did want to sort of do one last reminder during this meeting in case people haven't been here for the last couple of weeks and wanted to raise the last minute objection. Otherwise, I think it's time to merge. So sort of this is last warning unless anybody objects on the PR or in chat. I'll remove the hold by the end of the meeting. Vince, if you could LGTM it, then it'll merge when this meeting ends. Cool. And Vince, you've got the next one, which is stronger link between machines and cluster, number 41.
Yeah, let's bring this up again. So we haven't decided if we want to pretty much allow multiple clusters to live in the same namespace yet, which also means like we will need to have like a strong link between machines and the cluster object. I want to raise this also because there is like some other efforts like kind of de-link the machine in cluster. So it would be great like if we can tie everything together and kind of make a decision on this so we can bring it forward.
Just to add to that, there's also been a discussion to basically do the reverse thing, which is like losing the coupling completely of machines to clusters. There's an open pull request, I have to find it, on which there was discussion if it would make sense to like move the complete machine set, machine deployment into its own API group. Yeah.
It looks like that's 645. The pull request you're talking about from Alberto.
Yeah, so I kind of see like this two things kind of conflicting with each other. I'm not sure what like the best answer is, like because we have so many use cases. In a way, like we kind of want to probably make everybody happy. Not sure if that's possible, but we'll see.
So the last time this came up was last week when we merged the PR to allow the nil cluster to be passed to the machine actuator. And at that time, we discussed the idea that maybe we would wait some period of time to see if there are any providers which depend on the cluster, if there are providers which don't. And then I think the question of whether or not you can have more than one cluster in a namespace, and the question of whether or not we have different API groups are related but distinct.
Right.
So as an example, I saw there was a PR for the AWS implement provider to make the cluster optional. And in that case, I looked at it and I thought, is there a good reason to make it optional for the AWS provider? I didn't see a reason. So I was kind of waiting to find out from others if they thought that there was a good reason to have the link. My current impression, and I need to write this up to make sure it's sensible, but I'm leaning towards the idea that if we have a control plane actuator, again, a distinct separate topic, but if we had a control plane resource and actuator, that would remove the one reason that I depend on the cluster resource now, and that is the API endpoint field of the cluster resource. Once that dependency is gone, I'm okay with making the cluster resource completely optional. I don't know. I think there are cases where it's unnecessary.
There was one use case. Well, there's an easier use case when you have the cluster object. If you want to delete the whole cluster, or you want to upgrade all the machines in the cluster at once, if you allow using the cluster object to make the change, like for a new version or for deleting, it makes it easier for the API to do that off the cluster. That's the only case I can think of where you'd want to keep it if we want to make our API a little simpler in those cases.
I think that's a really good point. So that's another area that I would like to see the cluster object fleshed out more and have better documentation regarding its purpose. And one really good use case would be if the cluster was the de facto interface for the user when managing the creation or deletion of clusters. In the past, I think it was Alvaro, but someone objected that it would be a poor user experience if deleting the cluster deleted the machines, since the user created the cluster and the machines themselves separately. And they would be surprised to find out that the cluster assumed ownership of this object that they created and decided to delete it.
Yeah, I think Vince brought up something similar when we chatted at KubeCon, which is as he was sort of coming new to this project, it was really unclear like what the purpose of the cluster was, like how you should use it, how it related to machines. And I think maybe we're trying to solve like a number of different use cases here. And that's kind of muddling things. Clayton made a really good point in, I think in this pull request, in pull 645, that API groups are sort of roughly analogous to life cycles for different components. And I think everyone would probably agree that the life cycle of a machine, it should be different than the life cycle of a cluster, which to me argues that they should be in different API groups. And I think we've also, as we've sort of been iterating here, come to some conclusions. Like David was saying, one, that machines might depend upon knowing an endpoint for a cluster. They don't actually depend upon sort of everything else that we might want to put in a cluster. Cluster sort of logically might make sense to be a grouping of machines, right? So I could imagine a cluster could own maybe machine sets. If you created a cluster with some machines initially, like it could have an owner ref for those, in which case it would make sense if you deleted the cluster that the machines would be deleted. Whereas if you created machines that were not underneath the cluster, it wouldn't make sense, right? So I think maybe we should sort of invert the problem and say, if we have a cluster object, a cluster inside of it has references or directly embedded machines or machine deployments or machine sets and a control plane, and we break that into a separate thing. And then there's sort of this third group of other things that we sort of have wedged into the cluster right now, which I would sort of roughly call like infrastructure bits, which are things like how the network is configured, which tend to be very provider specific. So in my mind, like as I've been sort of thinking about this since KubeCon, what we sort of want is machines, which we can use either independently or inside of a cluster. We want a control plane, which we could use inside of a cluster, and we need the infrastructure for a cluster that ties everything together. And I think maybe structuring it that way would make more sense. I think that would be kind of a disruptive change at this point, but it might sort of conceptually make the bits a lot more approachable for people. And then sort of breaking each of those into different API groups so they have different life cycles.
I think so too. Having the ability to have the strong link between the machines and the cluster would be a big advantage, and just make the API just seem to make more sense to people who are used to operators.
Yeah, and I think having the strong link go from cluster to machines, like via ownership, makes a lot of sense because you can drill downward that way. And if you have a machine, like then the question is, if I want to go from machine to what owns it, you could follow the owner ref if we set that. Like that would be a really nice sort of obvious way to do it. But it would also allow you to not set an owner ref and to have machines maybe that are not part of a cluster or that are implicitly part of a cluster if people still want to do like things in the same namespace.
Yeah. So this is like all I think covered in 639, which I linked, which is pretty much what we talked at KubeCon. And I don't like it that we put this onto next. That said, like the other establishing along the link, it's for this cycle. So I'm wondering if, because it's pre-alpha right now, we should actually make all this massive breaking changes now. And I'm kind of volunteering myself here, I know, but I think this is kind of needed. And I agree that like splitting things up, the cluster will become pretty much like a virtual connection at that point between machines and control planes. And then we could have like an infrastructure actuator that does other things, right, in the provider.
Yeah, I mean, my only concern about trying to put that in Alpha 1 is timelines, if we think we can get it done fast enough. I do also agree that now is a great time to make these sort of large sweeping breaking changes before we have cut in Alpha 1 and told people to start using it. I think it would be much better if when we cut the Alpha 1, we felt like we had a good organization of resources and a good separation into the API groups. It would also allow us to say, maybe cut an Alpha 1 of the machine's API group sooner if we can agree that that is in good shape, separately from having to cut an alpha of everything. I think there are a lot of people that are interested in getting the machine-specific part done faster, even if the other part lags a little bit. Obviously, it'd be great if we could do the whole thing. But that would allow us to also, in addition to having different API groups or different life cycles inside of a cluster, have different release sort of cycles or maturity life cycles for the different API groups too.
Yeah,
So Vince, it sounded like you were sort of signing up to do that. So what I would suggest is maybe starting with like a Google Doc, sort of with a quick summary, like a design doc saying, here's where we want to go. I think that'll be a lot easier for people to digest and agree to than trying to review code, because I assume that the code changes are going to be kind of sweeping and hard to review, right? So if we can sort of write it out sort of in English and explain to people, this is the intent, this is where we're headed, and get people to sign up on that, then everybody doesn't have to dive into all the code to understand the nuances of why we're doing it and how things will relate to each other.
Sounds good.
So maybe like optimistically, we can try to have something to talk about next week along those lines. And I'm going to pull 639 into V1 Alpha 1 at the same time.
You're on mute, Robbie.
Oops, sorry. Looking at the agenda, we have two things left. One of them is a PSA. We should probably do that quickly. And then that way we can spend the rest of the time on Tim's agenda item about the milestone. So Vince, can you do a quick PSA and we'll go to the milestone?
Yep. So last week we merged like two different PRs. One is like breaking changes for cluster cuddle. We removed all the Minikube specific flags and created like a bootstrapper agnostic package. And so all the flags right now like are pretty much agnostic. The bootstrap type now defaults to none. So like if you try to run cluster cuddle at this point without a bootstrapper, it probably won't work. And there is other like breaking changes, for example, Minikube and VM driver, which were specific to Minikube, are not there anymore, and you should migrate to bootstrap flags. Also, kind is available as a bootstrapper, and if you can use it and provide feedback, that would be great.
Excellent. Thank you, Vince. So we've got about 20 minutes left. And one of the things we talked about last week, I think, Tim, you weren't here, but I went over sort of the different milestones and what we were using them for. And talked about, we didn't go through all the different issues in the milestones, but I encouraged people to do that on their own time if they were interested. And we talked about trying to look at the milestones each week and try and drive them towards zero. So if my memory serves me correctly, last week we had about 23, I think, open things in V1 Alpha 1. We still have 23 open, but I just added one. So we've at least gotten one thing done in last week. And I think there are a number of PRs in flight as well that will close some of the other ones too. Hopefully next week we'll actually see that number start to drop, maybe get it below 20. Tim, I don't know, for KubeADM, what's sort of the process you guys use to go through this? Do you just share your screen and kind of walk through the milestones? Do you try to, I get to do this today, but do you try to pre-plan and say, these are the ones we think might get done in the next week, let's focus on a couple of them? What have you found to be effective?
Typically, we don't micro-organize for subsections of things that have already been triaged for a milestone. We just kind of like federate and go. And then over time, like when we have a sync, we periodically will go through the details and see what's left and remaining open. I think it becomes ambiguous from an external observer because we haven't had a release of cluster API of what the status is. I think that's the common question, comment, complaint, concern that I get poked on is like, when is the V1 Alpha 1? And from the outside world looking in, it hasn't been readily apparent because it's always been soon. The question of when is soon done is the one that's been nebulous. So if there are high priority items or ambiguous things, usually we go through them together.
When we went through initially and triage things into different milestones, we tried to assign everything for V1 Alpha 1 to an owner. And I'm looking now and I see a couple of things that are not assigned. Do you think it'd be useful to spend a couple of minutes highlighting those issues and seeing if somebody can sign up to do them?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I wanted to make a generic suggestion here. Like, this is V1 Alpha 1, and maybe it's a good idea to start pushing API changes, iterations to the API more often. I guess my point is that it's not scary to release V1 Alpha 1 even if it's not in a complete state, like punt items to the next iteration pretty much. Because consumers, they want it immediately, but at the same time, you can pretty much stay in alpha for a long time with a lot of V1 Alpha X iterations. I guess that was my point.
Are you just talking about the difference between providers pinning to a particular SHA versus having a tag?
Well, the API iteration is per release, from what I say, per cluster API release, and it's just a claim on a version basically. And have you guys decided, compared to the Kubernetes release cycle, how often are you going to bump, for instance, the API once, of course, the first version is out?
Too soon.
Because if you release V1 Alpha 1 next month, should it be 6 months to the next V1 Alpha? I guess that was my question mostly. Anyway, yeah, this too soon, definitely.
Okay, there are 6 unassigned issues in the Alpha 1 milestone. So I'm gonna just read through those real quick. The first one is integration test for the machine controller. So somebody last year suggested that we want to have an integration test to where we test create, delete, update, scale up, scale down, and a bit of a stress test. I think we actually got a PR that did that sort of internally, as a unit test. And I guess the question is, do people think, well, does anyone want to sign up for this, I guess is one question. And do we need more testing than what we have in our unit tests for alpha, I guess would be another question. I think reading the title, we triage this into alpha 1, but as I look at it and think about the PRs that I've seen go in recently, I'm not actually sure how much more we need to do here to feel comfortable with the implementation.
I mean, I guess part of my question was, are these items essential for the V1 Alpha 1 release? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that was what I was just asking right now too. We initially triaged it into alpha 1, but maybe it should just be closed and we say we've got unit tests, and for now we think those are sufficient. Or we just stick it in next, and this is a great spot for someone new to the project to start adding value.
My
I think it's
prediction would be, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead, David.
I was going to say, I think we could take this out of V1 Alpha 1. I don't think we need to yet. Like maybe it's too soon to make those decisions. Because this is a great thing for, so having more tests, I think, would be better. I think it'd be appreciated, and it'd make us feel more confident about V1 Alpha 1. We might look at it and decide we have enough tests, but I don't know that anyone's looked yet. So I just don't know that it's, I think there's value in having it on the list because it highlights something that's important for V1 Alpha 1, whether it's necessary or not. Maybe we could revisit later.
Okay, that sounds good to me. So in that case, we're also saying it's not urgent to find an assignee if someone wants to pick this up, or if we get closer to the end and we feel like this becomes more urgent, then we will push harder to have an assignee. Excellent. All right, so the second one is support for scaling down specific machines. One of my colleagues, Messam, volunteered to push that from Google's side. I think there are a lot of interested parties on this one. So, and luckily in GitHub, you can assign to multiple people. So if other folks are also interested in signing up for this, please let me know, and I can also tag you on the issue. Apparently I need to add Messam to the org before that'll actually work. So GitHub won't let me assign it. But he has volunteered to work on this.
Can you please share the screen, Robert?
Sure. Let's see. I think that's their phone. Does that look right?
Yes.
75. So the next one is 493. So this is ability to define a set of labels, annotations, and taints to be created on newly created nodes. This is one I referenced earlier with this comment from Derek about these things being additive. And I feel like the API already supports this. The question is whether, sort of where in the implementation this should be realized, right? So right now it's possible to do this using kubelet flags, right? But then every provider has to re-implement the parsing of the fields and the plumbing through to kubelet flags for a kubelet to self-register with labels and taints. And the SIG auth group has said that they want to stop allowing kubelets to do that in the future because it's a security risk. In which case, it seems like the right place to do this is in the machine controller and have the machine controller set the labels. There's a little bit of a race condition there also. Unless we somehow mark machines not ready or something until we have been able to label them. I think talking to Mike Denise last year, he had a possible design for doing that that was shared with the community. Maybe I should dig that up and add it to this issue. In any case, is this something that someone feels strongly about and or is willing to take on in the V1 Alpha timeframe? There are a number of OpenShift folks that are interested in this issue in addition to Siddharth, so maybe we can ask them if Siddharth, if you think this is something you can't pick up.
So, hi. So, I mean, in the vSphere provider implementation of the cluster API, we I mean, this is basically based on our discussion earlier around the same topic. And I was basically asking about whether we can use Kuberium specific flags. I mean, the current implementation as it stands today for the cluster API provider vSphere, we kind of handled this requirement via the Kuberium flags. And I think if I remember correctly, the last discussion was if there is a much more broader common way of dealing with that, which is secure and handles like the race conditions and all of these concerns, then the option was like we can then all move to just that one implementation. I'm not very sure if we had made any progress on for example, the Kuberium side, because I think there was some, I forgot which maybe some different SIG, I guess, or some different area that we're supposed to, looking at addressing this as a holistic issue. I'm not very sure what the pointer was, like which particular one.
Okay, yeah, I think I can drop a pointer in here to the proposal that Mike had for restricting the ability to set labels and taints. I'm not sure where that is in implementation, if it's still just a proposal or if anybody's actually building something based on the proposal. Yeah, so I think what you sort of reiterated what I said, which is right now a provider can do this themselves explicitly by plumbing things through to flags in the kubelets and Kubedium. But ideally we would have common code that does this, that works consistently across providers. Like we shouldn't have to re-implement this every time.
Yes, I think I also feel very same. I think if not now, very soon we will anyway have to define a very generic way of dealing with the taints. Actually, you can call it the propagation of taints, labels, and so on from machine deployment to set and the machines. Because even in the rolling update, we have not yet seen, but we recently tried to implement a feature where when you do a rolling update, it does so happen that on the old machine set where the machines are from where the machines are being migrated to new, you would probably want to put the taint of prefer no schedule and so on. So otherwise, you will see that the pods are continuously getting rescheduled on the own machine set, and you will see that many pods are getting started for no reason, right? So this feature then will complement that and will be very useful in one way. So I would rather recommend that if we could come up with a generalized model, which could be as simple as so I saw the comment of additive and not authoritative, and based on that we could come up with some simple model where we can maintain the desired state in a way that if deployment sees a certain kinds of taint on it, it can migrate it to set, and set sees it can migrate to machine. And machine is the one who is responsible to put it on the node. But then of course the questions will come that what happens when some state modifies in between, and how do you know whether it already existed and so on, right? So there we can rather be additive in general, and not really be preferred that okay, I will blindly remove if something was removed, but I will try to make sure what I have is always maintained at the underlying layer. Something like that we could go for first step. And there also I guess one new thing came up where I'm not sure whether it's a good idea yet or not, but we probably also might want to have kind of authoritative behavior for the specific kind of taints created by the machine controller, or I would say machine API controllers. For example, like of the rolling, right? So this is kind of an example where while the rolling update is going on, you somehow want to always maintain the preferred node schedule on the old machines. If someone goes and remove it from the machine, or while rolling update is going on, if node object is lost and new node object comes up, you probably want to still become authoritative and put the taint again on it, right? So we might want to think in that direction as well, that there could be two different kinds of taint, one coming from the user and one generated by the machine API controllers, where we want to be authoritative, where machine API controller will try to force it irrespective of what's going on that.
Yeah, I think maybe an elegant way to do that, Hardik, is to have the machine deployment controller, when you tell it to do an update, have it set the taint on the machine set, and then have the machine reconcile that. Because then you can put in the documentation, if you're using machine deployments and you do a rolling update, this is the behavior that you're going to see, right? And it's not sort of hidden in the implementation of the machine controller somewhere else. Like it's really obvious. It's something you see on the machine set. It's something you see on the machines in the API. And I think the other point is really good also, is that the notion of being additive, we should be reconciling that additiveness, right? Like it shouldn't be a fire and forget, like we said it once and then leave it alone. We should make sure that if you have specified that your desired state is to have these labels or taints, we keep those there. But in doing so, we don't remove other ones that users have set, right? So we make sure that the ones that you've requested that we put there stay, but we also leave other ones that you might have put yourself and don't take those away, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I think it sounds like we have some general agreement on how we might want to do this, but nobody's signed up to work on it yet. So we can, if somebody doesn't want to sign up now, we can ping it again next week. But if someone is interested in trying to drive this, either let me know or assign yourself to the issue.
Okay, so for preparing the doc, design doc, I could probably initially check on that, because we are internally discussing a lot this issue, that how to generally solve it for different controllers. So I guess probably whatever learnings are that I can try to put it on one doc and let's discuss it out.
Okay, I'm going to assign it to you for now, Hardik. I think the other thing we talked about, I think a little bit last week, but is worth reiterating, is that the assignee of an issue is not necessarily the person that has to do all the work for the issue, right? They're in some ways the person that's sort of helping coordinate the work for an issue, helping drive it forward. And if you see an issue that you want to work on or contribute to and it's assigned to someone else, don't take that as that person doesn't want help or there's not a way for you to contribute. So we're trying to make sure there is somebody sort of on the hook for driving each of these going forward. But just because everything in the milestone is assigned, if you do want to help work on things, there's always sort of room for people to help contribute. Okay, so next is remote node and object references. So I don't know if you want to give a brief synopsis of this, David, and or.
Sure. So the basic problem is that when you have machines, so when you have a distinction between manager clusters and managed clusters, the cluster API resources exist in the manager cluster, but not the managed cluster. And as a result, the link between the machine and the node does not exist. That has consequences. It means things like node conditions are not copied to the machine object, etc. And I think I document 3 of the consequences for higher level tooling in this ticket. I think we've seen a surprising number of implementations actually choose to use the manager managed model. So I feel like this is a fairly high priority. I'm willing to sign up for it unless somebody wants to do it much more than I do.
Given that we can assign multiple people in GitHub, I'm going to sign you up for it since you said that. And if other people also want to help work on this, please, again, assign yourself or coordinate with David to help contribute. And I agree. I think this is also really important given sort of the way we've seen the implementations evolve over time, which is maybe not what we expected when we initially put that field in the API. All right, so next one, Alvaro created, which is optional struct literal fields in the API don't allow defaulting. We referred to this earlier. I think there's agreement that we should fix this. We just need someone to create the PRs and go ahead and fix it. And Alvaro, you created a first PR here that's referenced, but I think we sort of need to do it more consistently across the API surface.
Yeah, I can just look through it and look which ones we have and continue.
Cool, thanks. I'm gonna assign that one to you. And the last one, we labeled this one as awaiting more evidence, which Tim had mentioned is something using kubeadm for somebody filed an issue. We're waiting for them to tell us more about it before we bother trying to triage it further. So I think this one we can ignore for now. So if we go back to the query, we're down to 3. Which is this last one that we're ignoring. The first one that I was unable to assign, or the middle one that I was unable to assign because Messum's not in the org, and the third one which we decided didn't need an assignee and we would be willing to punt. So one last thing I'll do, we have 2 minutes left, is we have 2 issues that don't have a milestone, so we can look at those briefly and triage them. So cluster validation fails even though a cluster has been created. I believe there is a PR open to try and fix cluster validation. So I'm going to optimistically throw that into this milestone. We can kick it out later. The second one is the cluster deployer should support creation of clusters with an HA control plane. Looks like Vince, you were CC'd on this. Do you have any other information about this one?
Okay, I was CC'd on it. Oh, I think this is because like we hard code that, or like we throw an error like when you have multiple control planes, which is not ideal. I mean, the AWS provider actually has support for HA now in some way. Chuck might speak more to that, but I think we probably need to add like support like here upstream for it.
Okay, and do you think that's something we should try to target for Alpha 1?
Chuck, is this blocking AWS provider or no?
This is not blocking. This is sort of a decision that I think we were talking about if cluster, cluster deployer, cluster control. I think this is actually related to cluster controller. Is that right? Cluster control, yeah. So is cluster control the tool we actually want to use in the future? It's not blocking right now because of the phases work. So this doesn't really matter very much to cluster API. And whether or not cluster, like if cluster control is just something to get people started, then it probably doesn't need to support HA. But that's a discussion that we can have.
Yeah, I'll put it for next because also this relates into if we split the actuator into control plane actuator, like it'll probably go in there anyway.
Okay, cool. I will stick it in next, and yeah, maybe we can close it as obsolete based on the other one.
Yeah.
Cool. Excellent. All right, so we're down to 0 issues that need triage, which is excellent. We are also out of time. I'm going to go ahead and we'll wrap up the meeting. Thank you everyone for coming. If you have an issue in the Alpha 1 milestone assigned to you, please try to make some progress on it over the next week, even if it's just updating the issue saying I wasn't able to get to this. I think it would be great to sort of see all of those, at least making sort of incremental steps to try and get them towards resolution. We're at the end of the meeting. I haven't seen anybody object to merging the maintainers PR, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And then hopefully that helps us keep the product velocity going. And again, thanks, Vince, for all your contributions. We're excited to have you as a maintainer. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you guys next week.